Hi, friends and comrades, and welcome to another episode of the End of Sport podcast. My name is Nathan Kalman-Lamb, and I'm here today with my friend Priyansh. Priyansh, how you doing?
I'm doing well and really excited for today's conversation.
I'm so excited too, because we have today Nikhil Pal Singh, professor of social and cultural analysis and history at NYU and faculty director of the NYU Prison Education Program, with us today. Nikhil, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with both of you.
So, Nikhil, you know, I've I've been reading your work for a long time, and it's really keen to have you today, especially because you recently authored this really exceptionally important essay on our current conjuncture, which we find ourselves in, right? Which has been Nathan's been mentioning this on the podcast a number of times. It's called Homeland Empire. And was published by Equator Mag, which is a platform that I'd encourage many of our listeners to go ahead and check out. So we're really going to dig into this piece today, and how it helps us because obviously we like to think about sport here, to think through sport in this moment. But just to begin with, can you briefly explain what your thesis is here, and what does Homeland Empire mean, and how does it intervene in attempts to make sense of the current MAGA project?
Okay, sure. Thank you. There are probably two or three major points I would emphasize. First of all, I think Homeland Empire is a way of navigating questions that have kind of been perennial around Trump, which is whether we should think of Trump as a continuity with the past or some kind of break. And what I suggest in Homeland Empire is that this binary doesn't really work to understand Trump. That on the one hand, we could say that Trump is building on the institutional and kind of legal innovations of his liberal predecessors, particularly as they developed through the emergence of the carceral state in the United States and then the global war on terror. So these are large-scale projects of state violence that involve building up institutions of coercion and then developing legal and moral rationalizations for these institutions. And clearly, these are central to enabling what Trump is now doing, right? So we could say the war on drugs or the war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on migrants have a kind of continuity to them, and they're layered, they're palimpsestic, they feed off one another, they build off each other's capacities, right? And in some ways, the latest iteration of the war on migrants, really shows how these previous kind of inner wars, as I've called them in some of my other work, are kind of synergistic, right? They uh, the 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 DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, has signed thousands of agreements with local police forces to deputize ordinary police officers as immigration agents. They've um, they've repurposed local jails and prisons for detention. Um, they've uh, they've obviously started purchasing logistics warehouses and expanding detention capacities. So there's a way in which that that sort of vast now kind of coercive institutional structure, which was really created over several U.S. administrations, is now in the hands of the Trump administration. That's a clear line of continuity. Now, where does the break come in? I mean, I think the break is trickier, because in some ways we're dealing often with Trump, we're dealing with smoke and mirrors. I mean, there's a lot of bluster, there's a lot of spectacle, there's a lot of stuff that seems to come out of thin air, left field, and you're kind of like, what? Like, how is he suddenly talking about, seizing Greenland or even destabilizing Canada and like encouraging a secessionist movement in Alberta or whatever it might be? How do we make sense of some of these ideas that seem to not be grounded in any sort of prior either ideological or set of institutional or even kind of public conversations? Like, where do they come from? And I think that's where we actually can look to the more distant past and see the way in which the administration kind of is a scavenger of the past. It's looking for precedents. It's looking for precedents and kind of seeing what might stick. And when we sort of try to make some sense out of that and see where there may be some coherence, we can see that, first of all, it often involves going back to before what I've called the post-war settlement, before the moment in which the United States basically emerges as the world's superpower and essentially makes a pact with the rest of the world, certainly within the West, that it is going to be the kind of superintendent of a rule-bound order, which to some degree the United States is going to also follow itself. Of course, it's first among equals. It's obviously always carving out exceptions. It's not that the United States was scrupulous in its adherence to rule-bound order, but in broad measure, there was a sense that rule-bound order meant formal national sovereignty, respect for the rights of other nation states within a world system in which there would be an effort to create rules around things like trade, around refugees, around the use of force, laws of war, all of these different kind of matrices for organization and order. And that was also mirrored by a set of claims internally, which was that in order to justify and legitimate itself as the kind of leader or hegemon, the United States was also going to get its own house in order. It was going to eliminate unequal citizenship. It was going to finally, for the first time in some ways in its history, become a formal liberal democracy by ending racial segregation. And if you go back to something like the decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, it really brings these two things together. It really says, we are here to prove to the world that a liberal democracy that does not organize itself according to ideas of racial hierarchy and national origins distinction is the securest and best way to govern, human affairs. Right. So that there's a kind of dense and really thick kind of way that we could describe this sort of post-war compact, and maybe if you want to get into it more, we can. But the Trump administration really wants to overthrow that. And in overthrowing that, it sort of circles back to these, what I've called these archaic precedents, settler expansionism, um, uh, uh, kind of laws that really take us back to, really the founding generation. So one of the first laws they invoked for mass deportation was the Alien Enemies Act, which essentially said that migration was akin to an invasion or predatory incursion. Of course, that was rejected by the courts, but this searching for pretexts in the kind of archaic past. If you look at the kind of slop that comes out of the Department of Homeland Security and these sort of government social media accounts, often it's kind of images of sort of, pioneers on a kind of errand into the wilderness. It's a white supremacist, sort of a consciously white supremacist iconography oftentimes, but it's also very much bound up with these kind of frontier mythologies. Now you could easily say that, again, as I've already said, this is all just kind of slop and spectacle, and it doesn't really have a deeper meaning. But then when you see Trump doing things like uh, destabilizing kind of Western alliances by proposing to seize Greenland, or essentially beginning this process of blowing up boats in the Caribbean, kind of in the name of a sort of a drug war, but also based upon claims to what he has since called the Dunroe Doctrine, right, referring back to the Monroe Doctrine, another one of these kind of 19th century precedents. And when you put that in the context of how the Trump administration has kind of essentially retreated from its not just its own, but the sort of broader idea that the main conflict in the world revolves around containing China, and instead reorienting the United States to a kind of idea of hemispheric primacy and dominance, not just vis-a-vis North America, but Latin America as well, you can kind of see that some kind of shape is being put around this, a kind of what I call in the essay a kind of background image. And that background image I've named Homeland Empire, and it involves the marrying of these archaic precedents to these sort of modern institutional expansions of state coercion, but also a kind of collapsing of the foreign and the domestic in a kind of single domain of impunity and power, in which, police action overseas and military action at home kind of reverse the normal ways we think about these things. We think of policing usually as a domestic operation, military action overseas. But when you see basically these kind of military style raids in Minneapolis, and then when you see Nicolas Maduro kind of kidnapped and brought to trial in New York City, you're kind of like, well, what's happening here? How do these work together? One seems to be a kind of idea of, we're capturing a criminal and we're gonna give them due process, but it's a foreign head of state. The other, you're breaking down doors without warrants in the city of Minneapolis and just, arresting people, assaulting them, murdering them in the streets. And you're kind of like, well, what is this? This is akin to a kind of military occupation or a counterinsurgency war happening inside the country. So that collapse, I think, is something we have to make sense of, and that's what I've tried to do in the essay. So that was a long answer to kind of give you a big frame of what I'm doing. But I guess I would come back to this idea that it does two things. It sort of tries to solve this riddle of whether Trump is break or continuity, and then it tries to explain something about what I've called this kind of spatial and temporal collapse between the foreign and the domestic and the present and the past. And it sort of does all three things, I guess. I said it was two or three, but it is in fact three, as it sort of lays that out.
Yeah, that was absolutely incredible. And we are, a sports-oriented podcast here, so we have to at least, nominally bring this back to sports. Although I'm more interested in this as like a kind of theoretical framework for understanding our world. I don't think everything has to actually come back to sports. But we do have this weird event that is almost like fortuitously timed or not, in terms of like helping us think through the relationship between sport and all of these issues, because we have this World Cup, which is, again, the men's World Cup, the most popular sporting event in the world, which is taking place in this strange way where normally it's hosted by a single nation state, and is in fact being hosted by Canada, the United States, and Mexico together. And that is a brings in all of these strange relationships that you've been intimating, right? About, the Canada, the possible annexation of Canada as a 51st state. But now I think, it's fresh on our minds because the news is just, as we're recording this, we're just finding out about developments in Mexico that are taking place. And they honestly resonate to me with exactly what you were just saying, which is this weird way which we have drug problems in the United States, which have long been we have this notion of the war on drugs, right? Which is, again, a much older idea. This is not some kind of recent development, but the drug use is happening in a very significant way. There's a huge political economy around it in the United States, but the way in which Trump is kind of understanding this is there's no domestic solution to this as a problem. Trump is immediately looking outside of the United States and saying, well, we're going to, you, Mexico, have to take out the leader of your largest cartel, essentially, which is going to cause a domestic crisis in Mexico, right? Yeah. Because of the relative power of these cartels versus the state, right? There's a kind of a balance between the two, and it's a fine balance. And I think that sometimes the Mexican state has to live with that, right? In order to avoid widespread violence. But Trump from the outside is coming in and saying, no, you have to do we're telling you to solve our internal drug problem. You have to take out this leader, but with no plan. Right? So now we just have this mass violence in the streets of Mexico, including in Guadalajara, who are going to be hosting World Cup games mere months from now. And the airport, Air Canada, we know in Canada, Air Canada is not flying to Guadalajara anymore, right? It's not flying to that state. So I'm just kind of curious if you have any reflections on how these recent developments in Mexico sort of fit into this system that you're thinking through.
Yeah, it's a good question. It obviously goes beyond the scope of what I wrote about in that piece. I mean, as we've discussed before, I mean, I'm a huge fan and follower of international soccer, and especially the English Premier League. I'm kind of devoted to. Although I would say my love of soccer has waned significantly in the sort of in the sort of sense of watching it professionally, because of the ways in which these ownership structures have developed, and the ways they've essentially become a way of essentially laundering dirty oil money and other such things. It's quite revolting. And of course, FIFA is a deeply corrupt organization, as is UEFA. And we're sort of dealing with that reality as we love the game, and our kids play it and we play it, and try to bring it back to something more authentic, in terms of how we grew up with it. So, this last World Cup in Qatar was already a kind of very questionable operation, and we know from probably some of your previous podcasts about, all the labor issues, all the people that died building the stadiums, all the exploitation that went into that. I kind of tuned it out, to be honest, and certainly I would never have thought of traveling there. I did go to the World Cup in 2010 in South Africa, which was amazing in its own way. Although, of course, South Africa built a number of white elephant stadiums, or stadiums that subsequently became white elephants, in a country that suffers from enormous poverty. So, like, there are all of these elements of kind of the mounting of these games that that involve tremendous corruption, pay to play, misuse and misallocation of resources. So we know all of that, right? So that's just the backdrop to it, and all of that's still present. But now we have this other layer, right, of not only a kind of internally fractured sort of kind of North American region, uh, which is hosting, um, under tremendous pressure at both ends from the United States. And as you rightly point out, um, the United States pressure on Mexico is now seriously destabilizing Mexico internally, and it will be a really important thing for us to watch over the next months, how Scheinbaum, who's a tremendously popular and effective national leader, navigates this, having now uh, uh, essentially killed the top cartel leader in the country, right? So the fallout from this is going to be months long, if not beyond, several months long. And the pressure is not ceasing from the United States. The pressure at the border, the pressure internally, the threat of U.S. military intervention, it's kind of all hanging over. And then, of course, Canada. The relationship is, essentially at the lowest point it's ever been. We know Canadians aren't traveling to the United States, and Canadians are some of the biggest tourists to the United States. So there's a lot of sort of popular anger in Canada. Um, I don't, you can tell me more about what might be going on at the Canadian border, what that's like now. The Canadian border became really messy after 9/11, I remember, because I was living in Seattle then. It got better, but for a time it was incredibly difficult just to cross the border. It took hours. Um, I can only imagine what it's going to be like this summer, traveling between the US, Mexico, and Canada, as many travelers who would want to come to the World Cup would want to do, because you're not going to come all the way here without trying to get to Mexico and Canada, you know. Not to mention traveling across the United States. And then add on that the fact that um, we know from watching the ramping up of deportation and detention, that ordinary travelers are getting swept up in it routinely. You've got a misplaced paperwork, a visa that's not quite right. You look the wrong way, maybe you behave the wrong way in the eyes of a security agent, and the next thing you know, you're in detention potentially for months at a time. We've seen just ordinary people detained. Um, travelers with visas. Obviously, increasingly, we're seeing American citizens detained. Anyone who's under any kind of suspicion based upon the kind of latitude that's been given to the Department of Homeland Security can essentially be taken with questions asked later. And it often takes days, weeks, or months for those questions to be answered. Why would you come here? Why would you come here? Why would you travel here? I know people are still traveling to the United States. A lot of people are going to want to come to the World Cup, so I'm not anticipating that people won't come. I think it will be uh, not what it could have been, were it a truly inviting, sort of generous project to sort of bring people to the United States for this incredible festival of sport. Um, I think it's going to be really, really messy, and we're going to see a lot of ugly incidents. And a lot of people will probably stay away from stadiums. In terms of what's happening in Mexico, in particular, I mean, I think uh, immediately there are probably alarm bells going off all over the international sporting world, and I can only imagine what the conversation inside FIFA is like right now about why did we do this. This is going to be a real mess. So I don't feel like I'm adding a lot of great insight here. I'm just sort of stating the obvious, perhaps. Maybe you have more you would want to add to that, or to prompt.
No, I mean, I think that's an important, foundation for understanding the problems that are absolutely going to ensue here. But no, I want to steer us back here to something that you started telling us about, which was one aspect, because there's so many threads, right, to untangle, which is what was so helpful about your essay on Homeland Empire, is trying to find a way to create a coherence for us and thinking through something that seems so chaotic. But one obviously crucial aspect is the collapse of like what seems to be the so-called rules-based order, international order, right? And so you have written in that essay, quote, Trump has dispensed with the old legitimation strategies that were characterized by a commitment to rule-bound international order with exceptions. Now, this is unquestionably true, although obviously the abandonment of the fiction of a rule-bound order that our Canadian Prime Minister Carney, right, notably acknowledged in his much-touted Davos speech, was ushered in really by liberals, which is to say the Democrats in the United States, in their enthusiastic collaboration in the Gaza genocide.
Mhm.
This collapse has also spectacularly played out in the arena of global sport, as Israel has been allowed to participate, including in the recent Winter Olympics, and there's been rightfully a lot of controversy around that,
Yeah.
and World Cup qualifying,
Yeah.
despite perpetuating what we have called athleticide. And we know that the U.S. is transparently the principal reason why this has been allowed to occur, right?
Yes.
So what I'm curious about and think might be notable here is the amount of resistance, though, that this has also engendered at the same time. Israeli athletes were loudly booed in Milano, just as VP Vance was in the opening ceremonies. And Gramsci and Althusser have taught us that a capitalist state is strongest when it operates through hegemony, right? Like tacit consent achieved through ideology, which is perhaps how we might understand the fiction of the rule-bound international order in a way. Is if we all believe that was an order that was operating, that's kind of like what Carney was telling us, in a sense. That actually makes a lot of stability for those with power in that order to act as they want to. But as that fiction collapses, and as you wrote, quote, legal authority and institutional power are being redirected toward an overriding end, governing populations as subjects rather than citizens. Doesn't this mean then that consent, it seems to me, is also collapsing? There isn't even the illusion that people are citizens now. We're like treating them as subjects. Has the US, NATO, Israeli imperialist order overreached its hegemony? And does that produce vulnerability in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think you put it well, and I think a couple of things that I would just circle back through what you just laid out. I mean, one is that we could say hegemony has been unraveling for some time. So even there, it's not a sudden, revelation. It's you could track some of it all the way back probably to the Vietnam War, even. Clearly the 2003 Iraq invasion was a moment that sort of signaled the U.S. on the precipice, trying to sell the war to the United Nations. Clearly, a kind of example of still operating within the old legitimating frameworks, and then when failing, invading anyway with a coalition of the willing, so called, right? So there's been a kind of unsteadiness to this hegemony for quite some time. Um, an increasing emphasis on coercion over consent, because that's essentially what hegemony does. It marries coercion and consent, but it says consent is important. And in fact, the more you can enlarge the arena for consent, even if you have an order that is fundamentally coercive, and no one would say that hegemonic orders are not coercive. But if you can enlarge the order of consent, you have a much stronger basis for your rule. They're clearly not that interested in consent. They believe they can essentially operate what we might call dominance without hegemony, to borrow a phrase from Ranajit Guha. And they also tend to substitute spectacle for for sort of reasoned or even kind of coherent sort of ideological claims upon the public, right? So there's this sort of sense that you can kind of move from a kind of event to event, sort of a disruptive display of power, that sort of occupies attention and galvanizes a news cycle, until it exhausts itself, and then you do the next one, right? And there's something about spectacle here that probably is also obviously clearly relevant to the conversation about sport, um, that might be interesting to to explore a little further, because I think we might think of that as a kind of a mutation of hegemony, a hegemony that's less about a kind of coherent ideological appeal and more about um, a kind of capturing of fractured and episodic attention, right? That doesn't actually then produce a sort of a set of coherent claims or conceptions of the world, but actually operates through its own sort of, as I call in the essay, kind of pyrotechnic, um, you know, um, uh, out kind of bursts, right? You sort of set fire to something and everybody watches it. And then you set fire to something else and everybody watches it, right? You set fire to something else and everybody watches it. And there's a little bit of that aspect to it, right? And I was just noting, just as a fleeting image, Kash Patel, the FBI director, showing up in the dressing room of the USA hockey team at the Olympics after they won the gold against Canada, right? And like drinking beer and like acting completely outside of any professional norms, paid for on the government dime, obviously. And and the whole thing is like it's obscene and it's absurd, but it's an effort to graft to the administration a sort of this sort of moment of kind of nationalist triumph, and to sort of offset and counter what we would see as actually the more consistent story of the Olympics, which is US athletes speaking out against the government and against its abuses, against its violence, in a way that's really outraged and upset the right inside the United States. So the resistance is everywhere, and the resistance is spreading. There is no consent to this. There is a widespread sense that what is happening is wrong. It is not a popular administration. But it actually does seem to believe it can keep operating through this kind of modality of dominance and spectacle, of kind of ongoing ruination. Um, and I think that will continue until it doesn't, in some sense, until either the resistance becomes strong enough. If we actually have an election in 2026, which goes the way most of us think it will go, um, if the Democratic Party, and this is a whole nother problem in the United States, can really uh, uh, grow a spine and become something more than just the kind of feckless, even quasi-loyal opposition to Trump, um, around the issues that people care about the most right now, which is, ending the mass deportation project, solving the affordability crisis, and getting the United States out of permanent war, right? And we're about to see another potential war start in Iran, which the US has arguably been contemplating ever since 9/11. And which maybe is going to really take the mask off that made us think that MAGA and the neocon project and even the progressives were anything different from one another when it came to U.S. foreign policy. You know, and the Middle East plays a very particular role within the Homeland Empire, which I didn't write about in the essay, but particularly when you think of Israel, I mean, what state is more emblematic of the Homeland Empire than Israel? I mean, it is almost as if Israel, despite being non-contiguous with the United States, is part of American territory, is part of the American ideological fabric. So much so that you have the Israeli head of state invited into Congress to give speeches and then be given standing ovations. You have Israeli and Israeli Americans traveling back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, serving in the IDF, serving in the Israeli government, founding corporations that are deeply linked into the U.S. national security state. So there's something very particular about the special relationship with Israel and the way it's enables a projection, or has enabled a projection of American power into the Middle East, and now in many ways shapes and defines the kinds of policies the United States will pursue in the region, because of course it's in the Israeli interests that the US fight a war with Iran, because the Israelis don't want to have any countervailing power to their own designs within that region. So the US is doing Israel's bidding. But in the United States, it's often very, very difficult to determine where the United States ends and Israel begins, even though fissures are growing within that relationship, both on the left and on the right. So there's a whole nother essay to be written. And in the book that I'm kind of planning out of this piece on Homeland Empire, I will have a chapter on Israel, at least a chapter that sort of tries to lay that our argument out in some more detail and depth.
I love that. Can I just say, to just jump in, I know Priyansh has a question here, but you know what? Americans are also serving as Israeli Olympic athletes. the bobsled team that had so much controversy, right? The athlete who the Swiss commentators' comments were all about is just an American who happens to be now an Israeli citizen, and because he couldn't hack it on the American team, right, he can compete for Israel instead. So you couldn't be more right.
I mean, I do want to just pose one note of caution on this, which is that I think we should obviously want to welcome, people having multiple nationalities, dual nationality. There's no necessary problem with people having connections to many different places and countries, and I think all of that should be celebrated. But there is something very particular about the way in which a kind of relationship to Israel and the United States licenses not only Israeli violence, but a kind of disavowal of that violence, right? And those things have kind of gone together for quite a long time.
Absolutely. I mean, I want to also pick up on something that you said about the spectacle, and trying to think about, these traits or characteristics of spectacle that travel across different like fascist contexts globally. Because
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one context that I'm very familiar with since I'm from India is that how closely the Modi regime is tied to a spectacle with the demonetization in 2016, or with obviously the constant standoffs with Pakistan on the border, but also hosting these events, right? Like the G20 summit was a big deal in New Delhi. Well, last week we had the scenes from the AI summit, which which the government made a big deal of. uh, you mentioned this very interesting phrase right at the beginning of the essay, which is kinetic action, this big bang of spectacle leaving shock and awe in its wake, which not only Trump, but other fascists like Modi and, Javier Milei, and, there's few of them, then we can go on naming them. But this tendency towards, grand pageantry, which makes us wonder why these spectacular, especially these media mediated events, are so central to the Trump regime, but also regimes of its ilk. Now, it's not just kinetic action of the military operations, but the grand sports event is so central to this, right? Like, because we've seen these ice operations that have been carried out outside football stadiums in the US, but Trump is betting big on a series of such events, like the World Cup, then there's LA 28 Olympics, the Patriot Games, which will apparently supposed to celebrate 250 years of American independence. Now, many of these usually are compared on a global scale with Berlin Olympics in 36. But do you see any differences especially in this contemporary moment, of what the traits of these spectacles are, if we're thinking in a global fascism kind of lens?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that you're absolutely right that, I think first of all, we have to think in terms of a kind of global far right that's networked in relationship with one another, sort of imitating, learning. There's a uh, there are meetings happening between U.S. government officials and AfD, officials in Germany. The U.S. is obviously intervening profoundly in kind of internal European politics. Um, uh, there's been admiration for Modi for some time, in the Trump camp. There are Hindu nationalists in the United States who have supported Trump and had big rallies for him in places like New Jersey and in Texas, and so there's a there's a lot of there's a lot of discourse and traffic and imitation and flattery and kind of mutual admiration that's going on. Um, even though I think the alignment of interests between transnational fascists is going to prove elusive and will not really work out, with the way that they want they would hope. So I don't think we should think that there's actually a fascist international that's sort of emerging, but it's more like family resemblances and kind of and as I said, a process of sort of mutual learning and so forth. But to sort of get back to the point about international sport and how to think about this in the current moment, the thought that occurs to me is that while the pageantry is important, it's really more about how um, the the event can be sort of rendered into some kind of mediated form and then transmitted, right? So, you know, the U.S. hockey player with his broken teeth, the Pete Hegseth, bench pressing 300 pounds in front of, a room full of cheering Marines, the the sort of the sort of viral moment that can kind of be seized upon to kind of advance the agenda, and the way it sort of then blurs into, again, this entire sort of slop stream, that is sort of part of, I think, what now substitutes for persuasion and ideology, but is more sort of part of the just what they're constantly sort of shooting into our into our phones and into our computer screens and so on and so forth, right? So that's kind of how I think about it. I think maybe it's also because all of our attention is so fragmented. Do any of us even all sit and watch the same things anymore, or at the same time? Or, are these events really what they were? I mean, was the US defeating Canada in this past Winter Olympics akin to the victory over the Soviet Union in, was it the 1980 Olympics? Or was it that, well, I remember that as a child, as being like a huge, huge thing, that the entire country was kind of fixated on. I don't know that this latest thing really is that. It's and also I think that the MAGA exists within its own media bubble. Um, it's very interested in communicating to its own, what it imagines to be its own audience. right? And that's certainly not someone like me or most people I know. So then I kind of wonder, how is this stuff really working? I think it's one of the reasons why they have to constantly be generating more content. They're basically content factories and farms, but at a certain point, the content becomes kind of undifferentiated. How do you determine whether something is more significant than something else? I mean, that's going to, in the end, be down to sort of wider publics really basically saying, no, this actually really does matter. I think when you murder someone on the street in Minneapolis, it really does matter. And wider publics really tune in and pay attention. And then the imagery doesn't operate in the way that they want it to. It actually operates in some ways against their own purposes. So that's just, again, like maybe a bit of an off the cuff answer. I don't know that I have a better one. I'm not really a careful student of media or of visual culture. It's not really my thing. And I think there are many scholars who are thinking about this way more deeply than I am. But I'd also love to hear if you have more thoughts about it.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm always curious about this, especially with the questions of like media and how this spectacle is, mediated in multiple forms. But you did say that you're interested in, international football or soccer. So I actually wanted to ask you about something particularly which has been happening, which is kind of linked to this media question as well, right? Like, I, you know. I mean, recently we had the Super Bowl where obviously, Bad Bunny's performance was such a huge, like in the media sphere, it was like this huge conversation, especially because of the racist attacks on Bad Bunny, and but also is saying many things about Latinos, quote unquote Latinos, broadly speaking. But one thing that's happened in the field of international football is that the Copa America has now found a home in the U.S. because the last two editions were here, and now the US is apparently wants to host the 2028 Copa America as well. And I'm particularly curious about this in the this conversation around hemispheric power grabs that are happening, because it's clear that this is being pushed by the American sports broadcasters who want to capture this market, and don't want to lose the viewers that they will gain ahead of the World Cup, during the World Cup, and then going forward. Um, and so in this particular moment, how are you like seeing this hemispheric relationship playing out with Latin America, and especially maybe through football, but also through different forms through which this debate is taking place? Yes.
Yeah, again, I think a really good question, and takes me maybe a little out of my comfort zone, even in some ways. I think that I'll try to answer it in this way. I think I've long made the argument that Trump is not the new settlement. Trump is, uh, I mean, people throw around Gramscian language a lot, to go back to Nathan's earlier or point about hegemony. And some people have described this period as an interregnum. Hegemony is collapsing and we're waiting for the next hegemony to sort of come along. And then recently some people have said, interregnum is the wrong way to think about it. We're not heading towards a new settlement. We're actually in something different that we have to try to make sense of. And I think I'm more inclined to that view. But if we are inclined to that view, it's still very unclear. Homeland Empire is a provisional name for something, um, which is not stable, um, and is not actually generating a new order, and underneath all kinds of countervailing tendencies and struggles are happening, including the resistance that we've discussed, but including people trying to figure out ways that they can operate within it in new ways. You know, the idea that globalization ended, for example, is silly. We live in a globalized world. Globalization changed the world irrevocably. The idea that the United States is not becoming more like Latin America, right, despite Trump, um, is folly. I mean, we have a huge Latin American population within the United States. We have massive trading relationships with Mexico, a massive border, a country that is fascinated and inspired by the kind of cultural production that comes from the South, including international soccer, which has taken root in the United States with a number of Latino players who are like now emerging as international talents, and not just Latino players, but the children of various immigrants or naturalized citizens who are now part of the US national team, to go back to that earlier point, and actually making their name in the United States as world-class players. I mean, all of this is like something to, you know, to it's not really to celebrate or condemn. But it definitely runs against the grain of kind of the nativist animus that the Trump administration tries to sort of foreground and make central. I say this in the essay that, you know, the nativism that we're seeing, and the kind of this sort of, again, sort of bizarre discourse of like the heritage American, um, that is now supposedly the privileged national subject, the efforts to get rid of things like birthright citizenship, which is another thing that takes us back to these archaic 19th century sort of debates. None of these are popular ideas, and none of these ideas are really grounded in the fabric of what the United States actually is, in sort of its everyday composition and constitution. You know, it doesn't mirror life in most American cities, or even in American suburbs, or even in some rural parts of the United States, which are increasingly mixed, you know, which increasingly have, you know, local soccer teams comprised of, kids born in Mexico or Brazil, you know, playing alongside, you know, kids born in the United States with, you know, with white parents who have maybe lived here for generations, you know, with being absolutely fine together. You know, I grew up in New Jersey, and I'm of a certain age. I've been a naturalized citizen the United States for more than 50 years. You know, I was playing against kids who in Ironbound, Newark, and Elizabeth, New Jersey, and in in the Union County Sports Club, and in Kearney, and in all of these places. Every single one of them came from, you know, a different place, from Ireland, from Scotland, from Portugal, from Mexico, uh, you know, and this was 50 years ago or 40 years ago, right? So it's like it's weird to many of us, especially if you grew up in like the Northeast of the United States, um, in a sort of just ordinary, you know, multilingual, multicultural environment where people essentially just got along, you know. And this doesn't gainsay the idea that there haven't been issues with the border, or that there wasn't a kind of a destabilizing period following COVID, which I sort of referenced in the essay. You know, one can talk about the specificities of kind of immigration and the management of migration, and some of the ways in which it intersects with kind of larger scale social problems and crises, you know. But migration writ large, or the idea of the United States as a country composed and constituted through multiple migrations, I mean, that's just a fact. That's just what the country is, you know. And that's the way in which people have made sense of it. That's the way people have conducted business. That's the way American culture has developed, and it will continue to develop in these ways. And so I see some of these things that you're referring to, Priyansh, you know, about, you know, trying to think about how to capture markets, and how to sort of build cultural products and sports products and other things that appeal beyond the borders of the United States, as just sort of part and parcel of that. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, that was really, really interesting. And I know we don't have too much time left. I want to ask you just one more question here, because it harkens back to actually what you were mentioning at the very beginning of this conversation, which is this pivot that we've seen away from China as enemy, right? This seemingly that we had this new Cold War framework emerging that was certainly the Biden administration's, approach to the world system. And actually, and I know you've been paying close attention to China's rise and the sort of shifting balance of power. I'm curious. I have some ideas myself, but I'd love to hear you talk about, why has China been able to resist Trump's bullying, essentially, in a way that no other country has? And is the rise of the sort of Donroe Doctrine and Homeland Empire in some way a desperate attempt to ward off the rise of Chinese hegemony? Will it work? What to make of it?
competition with China, China fear, potentially China war, it always is lurking in the background now. I mean, the United States, does the United States want to is the United States really willing to give up primacy? I think that's an open question. It would seem that the United States is retreating from a notion of primacy, but in a way, not really. And I think you can read a lot of strategic moves in relationship to China, maybe 2-3 degrees back, right? Even war with Iran is sort of part of kind of the strategic calculation around China. Um, Certainly, the idea that we're going to declare the Western Hemisphere off limits. I think recently Chile agreed to uh, undersea cables with China, to construct these undersea cables with China, and the United States immediately revoked the visas of some top Chilean officials. So there's ongoing, machinations that relate to um, the concern about China and its influence and its power globally, and the effort on the part of the US to, sort of shore up its own bases of power. But clearly, it seems to me that the idea that you are going to frontally um, compete with China and contain China, that really began in the first Trump administration, which was itself, remember, a repudiation of Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was also an effort to try to contain China within a web of sort of Asian alliances that the United States would be at the center of. Trump rejected that. Trump went for the tariff war for direct competition. Then Biden built in this kind of more sort of strategically formulated idea of the small yard, high fence, the sort of restrictions on high-tech transfers and all of this. Then Trump sort of tried to ratchet tariff war even further, even higher with China in Trump 2.0, and China basically struck back with the rare earths moratorium. And of course, you ask the question, how has China been successful? Well, China, manufactures things for the entire world now. China is the leader in renewable energy. China builds basically everything that the world needs, even for its own manufacturing, which is why tariffing China is counterproductive if you want to rebuild manufacturing and supply chains. You still need things that China makes. So it's extremely difficult to now disentangle or decouple from China. And in fact, I think recently someone in the Trump administration says we're no longer thinking of decoupling. This isn't about decoupling. This is about, a sort of more constructive kind of competition. I still think China fear, China war is in the background. I don't think we'll see it go away, and I think we could easily see it resurface in some potentially very, very scary ways going forward. But I do think that the Homeland Empire and the sort of reorientation towards these kind of ideas of an American sphere, competition, but also American primacy in its own domain. I think all of that is calculated in some ways in relationship to China, and a recalibration of what the competition or confrontation with China is going to be for now, at least for the foreseeable future. So that's how I would go at that.
Thanks, Nikhil, for helping us think through this. You've been very generous in the way. This essay seems to have many lives, and we've obviously been following, the many conversations you've been having about Homeland Empire and how it stretches out thinking about Israel in relation to it, and also the China question. But as much as the core content and the argument of the essay has been subject to conversation, it was really great to hear from you in relation to sports particularly, and also learning that about the fact that you follow international football closely. So I know that in the coming months you will definitely have an eye on, irrespective of these mixed feelings that the World Cup is
I
evoking in
know,
all of us.
of course, of course. Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you both, and I always enjoy it.